My guest today is Dr. Ian Williams, who is a biochemist, philosopher, author, and artist. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you, Gill. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, so we have done this a couple of times before, but today is sort of unique in the sense that we have no topic, and the objective of the session really is to think about fake news, for lack of a better term. I think it's a defining challenge for society today, with artificial intelligence and differing opinions that seem to be highly segmented in society. When you receive a piece of not necessarily information, a piece of news, how does one determine that the truth of that? And it's not very simple, right? It's not necessarily scientific. Maybe I'll throw that back to you. I mean, as people with some scientific background, we have an understanding of the scientific process that typically uses data, create a hypothesis, create a null hypothesis, an alternative, and look for data to see if we can reject the null or accept the null. I mean, that is sort of the statistical data-driven process that we go through. But do people have the time to go through that process? That's sort of a larger question. But let me ask you a broader question. So when you receive a piece of news, I'm thinking about the general public, how should they think about it? I mean, how do they determine if that news is true or not?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, my training is in science, and you mentioned the scientific process, and the critical and acid test for good quality science is reproducibility. Unfortunately, for most of the issues that we face today, COVID aside for a moment, because that was both scientific and political, there isn't really an ability to run the experiment, to run the control. And so I think the first order is, well, two things. One is to question and ascertain the quality of the source. So, for example, again, depending upon one's political, moral, ethical view, one tends to look at different sources, publications, news programs, friends, what have you. And those, most people, I think, form a basis of inputs which they trust. And I think perhaps something that we lack as a society today is to question ourselves and to say, is this sort of feeding my prejudices, my inherent beliefs, and therefore I want to believe it? And what if I didn't? And if something comes up that you agree with, you tend not, I think, to go into it and say, oh, well, what's this based on, et cetera, et cetera. You just sort of take it and say, yeah, here's another piece of information. Whereas if it's not, then you just say, hey, dismiss it, it's fake news, blah, blah, blah. So I think that's probably one of the prime things that I would encourage our listeners and viewers to think about is, yeah, what are my own prejudices, or prejudice is a strong word, but my beliefs, my experiences that might sway me in this. So then I come back to the sources. And I think that if impartiality in news today is very difficult to find. And indeed, if you ask people what are their trusted sources, you have one group who might think the New York Times, the Economist, the BBC, I don't know. And of course, other people would say those are biased liberal publications that slant the news in their favor. Equally well, people who go to Fox News or perhaps other more to the right leaning news sources, again, would believe those. So,
yeah, let me push on this, Ian. So, you are saying that veracity is a function of source, but sources is also they change in time, and so can we take a source to be trustworthy forever? I mean, they might. So trustworthy is a loaded term,
Sure.
and so if you apply a pure scientific process, I would argue that you shouldn't really be thinking about the source, but actually the data, right? I mean,
Yeah, well, I would push back a little bit on that. You raise a good point. And I didn't mean to suggest that sources are immutable, even if one were to choose something and say, I trust this. But let's just double click on trustworthy for a little moment. I mentioned earlier that political news, moral, philosophical issues are very difficult to run controls on. But I think you can go and look at history. So if you take a source and you see a report, let's just say a newspaper for the sake of argument, and historically, if you go back perhaps over decades, you find that their reporting has been accurate, and that when it has not been accurate, they have corrected that. And I think one can point to a number of examples, again, particularly in journalism, where reputable newspapers, magazines, news stations have admitted this person faked the data. We're very sorry about that. We didn't know at the time. The sources were made up, whatever. And so I think you can go back and look at your sources from that perspective. You're absolutely right, of course, that sources change, editors change, political mores change, all of these things change. But the objectivity could be retained. And again, as I think about journalism, if there is an editor, as opposed to an individual just putting stuff out on the net, then he or she has an obligation to challenge the sources and to double click on them. And I think that you can tell news organizations that are willing to do that. And then you look at their sponsors, who their advertisers are. Again, all these things come back to my earlier point, where if the journal, newspaper, television, whatever it may be, internet source that you're looking at has heavy advertising from a particular group, then you need to question, well, is that slanted? Is that influencing the kinds of stories that are being put out? So that's how I think about trustworthiness in this sense.
Yeah. So I get that. So the way I will think about it is that if I run a machine learning model, or simply a statistical regression, the past history of the source is an attribute that we should put into that equation. In other words, if my objective is to figure out the probability of something to be true, then that equation should have the source as one of the attributes. There could be other attributes.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's an important, I mean, I haven't thought about this yet. So that's an important consideration. I think we sort of intuitively do it, right? But there's also a downside to it, which is if you're in the blue bucket, your trusted sources are X, Y, and Z. And if you're in the red bucket, your trusted sources are A, B, and C. So when you run that regression, you put that data into that as an attribute, and then you get some probability of that being true.
Yes.
It is a bit of a slippery slope, isn't it?
It is. I think one thing that's important in distinguishing here is what I would call factual news reporting and editorials. So I think we see today a lot of editorializing, if that's a word, from all publications, and that's fine. They're often said, this is just the view of our editors, what have you, and that's one thing. But it's another when, for example, look at the last election where there were questions about, was it Was it valid? Was it legal? Was it accurately counted? All of those issues. Those are pretty hard questions. They're almost scientific. You know, was there interference? Were all the votes counted, et cetera, et cetera? And I think you can look at some organizations that perhaps misrepresented that. And I think ultimately that gets found out. And so perhaps almost like the factual reporting is almost a little closer to scientific data. You know, 500 people were killed in the bombing here. Well, does that turn out to be true? You know, as opposed to an article that says, well, had the local government done more to screen people coming through this station, this wouldn't have been a problem. And therefore it's the local government's fault. The former is a fact, the latter is editorial spin. And I don't think you could or should filter that out, because that's very important. It raises a question. Again, I come back to my first comments, though, that you then need to check your own biases. You know, if you're willing to believe that, you know, security has been lax at this airport because of this whatever, then this just feeds into your preconception, as opposed to saying, did they really? Because as you quite correctly point out, to get an answer to that, okay, so these people were killed in the bombing, how did the terrorist or whomever get to that point? Then you have to do an awful lot of work. And that then comes back to, nobody's going to do that, frankly. I mean, maybe some investigative journalists. So then it comes back to trust and trustworthiness and history. So that's my thought on that.
Yes, I wondered, Ian, so factual reporting, as you say, it's a very complex thing. So I don't have a training as a journalist, but we see this in science, we see this in economics, where facts are typically not reported. Facts essentially sort of combined with biases are reported, because you cannot remove human bias from the process, right? So I would argue, and you might agree, that in science, at least, there is a replication question. There is a process by which this could be verified. But in economics and journalism, there are no replication questions. So if somebody goes out there and says X is equal to Y, we can only use, as you say, the trustworthiness of the source to say, is X is really equal to Y, because there will be no replication.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Again, I would just come back, even in those situations, and this is true in science as well, where, let's say, an economic assertion or a model is put forward, which happens all the time, and governments might take that model and base some of their economic policies on that. And then in a given amount of time, you can tell whether that's actually true or not. Did it actually happen? Is trickle-down economics really real, you know? So again, that doesn't help you much when a new model is put forward, you know. But again, the people who are commenting on that, and this, I think, it gets to the interesting point, maybe in the crux of fake news and trustworthiness, is the quality of the editorial comment or the critique. And that doesn't necessarily have to come from the source, it can be elsewhere. But again, I think we all, whether we like it or not, have to trust all manner of people. You take your car into the garage and you're told it needs a new whatever. Well, are you going to get on a YouTube and look at this and take it out? And are they, you know, you just don't know. But after a while, if there's this consistent, or you hear other things happening with this garage, you kind of know. So you have to trust the mechanic, you trust the physician, we trust people on fairly complex issues a lot. But again, in each one of those, now, I think because of our connected internet-linked society, one has this, what can I say, group recording, you know? 500 people went to this garage and they had great service, you know? That's pretty good. I think it's about the best one can really do, absent getting under the car yourself. So I think there are then these two aspects. One, as we've been talking about, the record, the historical record, then the realization that editorials can indeed be challenged and should be challenged. It's a sign of a vigorous, open society. And then you can also use peer review, sort of aggregating people just such as ourselves who are not expert, but it's like, predicting the Oscar winners. They tend to do pretty well if you just ask 5,000 people on the street. So maybe that's something that would be interesting to sort of check the newsworthiness. I mean, the veracity, perhaps. Do you think?
Some sort of peer review process for
just some sort of collective. I suppose we're now in the midst of this fake news, mostly as it relates to politics. I don't think there's a lot of fake news in medicine, and I mean there is some. Look at Theranos.
I beg to differ.
Okay, we'll get back. We'll get to that. Okay, but let's just say in politics for the moment. Again, if you're going to use, it's one thing to go onto Amazon and see that there are 1,000 5-star reports on this printer. I mean, why would people lie about that at that number? But of course, to get a sort of objective view by looking at peers on whether global warming is really going to be an economic crisis for us, much more difficult, perhaps. Definitely.
Yeah, I like that idea. I mean, when something is put out, generally in news media, it's put out by some person, and to verify it as actually truthful, you need some process like the peer review in science. So I want to go into a topic here. So this would be interesting. So this is what came up first, which is about extraterrestrials. there is a lot of extraterrestrial news in the waves or whatever. So there was a congressional hearing. There are whistleblowers. There are all sorts of. There is a Harvard physicist who went to some island and found things that he says are out from outside the solar system. There's so much noise in their waves about extraterrestrial. So when you're bombarded with this stuff, how does one determine it's not a black and white question. It is sort of assigning a probability if the news is true, right? How does one do that on something like that?
That's a very good example, actually, Gill, because in many ways it's sort of apolitical. I think the thing that springs into my mind, and I don't want to divert from this topic, but something that's quite analogous. You may have read recently where there's going to be another massive hunt for the Loch Ness monster.
Oh, yeah.
They're going to be putting millions of dollars, sending God knows what submarines and what have you.
Yeah.
Well, most people would say it's completely ridiculous. But there's something about both the Loch Ness monster and extraterrestrials that gets into the human condition of mystery. What do we hear about? Are we the only ones? There's something bigger out there. So a lot of people just want it to be true. And that comes back to my first point about checking your prejudices, right? As you have been a good exemplar of this, I think with the question of extraterrestrials, when you're trying to sort that out, some fairly straightforward scientific reasoning would say that this is extraordinarily improbable, just given distances, or we don't need to go through all of that. But that is possible. You don't see a lot of that. And if you do see that, it's sort of ignored, because what sells newspapers is a Harvard professor found, some bizarre element in excess in So I think there it's again, you come back to saying, what is skewing this? What is driving this desire, this belief, this feeling that there is something there. And I don't think you'd have the same issue. I'm trying to think of an example now that doesn't. Well, I was going to say, people could say there is gold in some, obscure place out in the middle of nowhere, and I'm sure a lot of people will go there, even though there are absolutely no data to support it. But yeah, the question you ask is a very good one. So if someone is, let's say, not particularly scientifically trained, how does he or she say, is this real? Is this something here? Are we not being told? That. And I don't know. What do you think?
No, it's really interesting. So this need to want something to be true, appears innate, especially with news pieces that are sort of controversial.
Yes.
Because you sort of fall on either side of that, and we have seen this in scientific arenas too. We don't, half the scientific papers cannot be replicated.
Right.
Proving a hypothesis is more likely than disproving it, because you don't get tenure by disproving a hypothesis.
This is true.
And so it's sort of the same process, isn't it? I mean, flowing out into the general public.
Yes.
It's basically saying, hey, somebody showed me a picture. I would rather be that it is extraterrestrial than saying, oh, let me go look at this and see if it's Photoshop.
Yes.
I mean, it takes too much time and
too much time. Yeah. And the data are difficult. Perhaps a more grounded example would be superconductivity. So I'm sure most of our listeners are aware that there has been work for the last 150 years now on measuring superconductivity, and by which we mean the ability to have electricity pass through something with no resistance, and therefore be an enormous energy saver. So there's been a lot of work on this, and the temperatures at which that can be achieved have moved from close to absolute zero now to something that could be achievable. A very difficult and complex field. People, card-carrying physicists can't really explain it. So how do we as individuals understand that? And then you have investment opportunities. I mean, if this is true, should I be investing in this group here that's done this? It's an analogous matter, and that's where I think one relies on the impartial expert, the person who doesn't have an iron in this fire. And for superconductivity, that's not too difficult to find. I think also for aliens, I think if one were to talk to a number of astrophysicists who are used to dealing with the time frames and distances that would be necessary for an alien life form to evolve and to contact us, they, I think, universally pretty much would say it's just vanishingly small.
Yeah, so the scientific process, I don't know. I mean, the way that I think about this, Ian, is that the Fermi paradox, when Enrico Fermi asked, where are they, is based on this idea that the Milky Way is 100,000 light years across, and if you can travel at 10% of the speed of light, any being will be sort of blanketing the Milky Way within like 10 million years. And we've been here 5 billion years. And so that's a basic question. It's called Fermi's paradox. Where is everybody?
Mm-hmm.
We don't see them. And if Fermi is right, they should be blanketing the Milky Way. We should see them in a lot of different places, not just one place. And so when there is a news piece that says, hey, there is a circular thing with blinking lights that is there, there are multiple issues with it, which is, I mean, the Earth is not that interesting a place for somebody to come. And And if they were to come here, there are let's say they want to come here, there are two options. One is to say, they want to be seen. If they want to be seen, they're not going to be in Utah with blinking lights. They will just go to Eiffel Tower or Taj Mahal or the White House, and they will be seen there for sure. If they don't want to be seen, they're not going to put their lights on.
No.
So there is something fundamentally wrong from a logic perspective when people see flying saucers with blinking lights in, vague places on Earth. What do you think?
Oh, I totally agree. And the idea, and I think you have said this in the past, the only reason to come here, apart from I don't know how many, let's say there are life forms that are dependent on water and oxygen. Let's just say that, and this species says, okay, well, there's this planet here that actually has that, assuming they can do that, because we're trying to do that as you speak. We're finding Earth-like planets. There are millions, if not billions, of them. Why would they come to this one? And then the only thing I can, as you pointed out, is, well, we'd have to have some way of indicating our presence. And the earliest thing would be radio waves, right? So 100 years, 150 years, whatever that is. So you have radio waves traveling for 150 years. So it's 150 light years roughly, right? And that is it's a relatively small number of nearby galaxies, et cetera, et cetera. And then to find that and to coincide with a life form that can actually see that, detect it, infer what it means, and then travel here, it's just ludicrous. But it just comes back to people's desire and the fact that they're seeing spaceships, saucers with lights. That comes straight out of Hollywood, right? Or Jules Verne, the late Victorian writers who postulated H.G. Wells that there was life on Mars and Venus and what have you. And so, again, why on earth would it be like that? It just doesn't make any sense. But we're being extremely rational. We're sort of approaching this. We started talking about the speed of light and all this. Most people don't really, I don't know anybody listening to this would say, oh, no, you're right. It can't be true. Forget about it. But I want it to be true. I want there to be E.T. I do. Somebody's going to solve all the world's problems. But of course, then the other ridiculous thing is if a life form is capable of coming here, they will enslave us in about 2 seconds. And that would be the end of that.
Yeah, but there are questions to be asked. So this is why sort of the fake news question comes back in,
yes,
right? So
yes, right.
there's questions to be asked about the scale of the universe.
Yes.
There are questions to be asked, like the Fermi paradox. If it is so, the scale of the universe, you say there's so many things out there.
Yes.
The probability of those things not having life is close to zero.
Yes.
Okay, that's a possibility.
Right.
But then you think about the Fermi paradox in close quarters, and you say if it is that likely, we should be seeing them everywhere. We don't see them. And then we have this is space-time constraint we have to really worry about. So when Marconi did the first transmission, radio transmission, that was 125 years ago. So we have about 30 exoplanets, about 125 light years from us. And those guys are hearing the Marconi transmission now. And they say, oh, these guys are so brilliant. I have to go to Earth. They're going to spend, there's a time dilation problem here. So it's difficult to really figure out, but they're going to spend an enormous amount of time to come here.
Well, you mentioned earlier, if they can travel at a tenth the speed of light, let's just say, so that's 15 years, right? They saw the very first one, but as we both know, that would have to coincide with the evolution on their planet of an intelligent life form that can travel at a tenth the speed of light. It can't be prehistoric, and most advanced life forms will kill themselves off. I mean, probably. I mean, it just happens time and time again. There are very few, even on here, apart from archaebacteria, about the only life form that survived the 3 billion years or whatever. Most others sort of come and go. So in any case, all those chances become very... But the interesting question, we can argue about this and convince ourselves, but the issue, it comes back, I think, to the, and this may be fundamental to fake news, is the innate desire that people have, that they want to believe what they hear. And they don't want to listen to a couple of people like us telling them why this isn't true. They want to know why, you know, these US fighter pilots see these things, but we haven't heard about it. You know, why are they hiding that? That's what they want to believe. I do believe.
Yeah, this is really interesting, Ian. I haven't really thought about this. So this desire for things to be true, things sort of on the edges, so to speak, to be true. Perhaps I should ask you, so do you think that would have some evolutionary advantages? Because we all seem to share that desire, which is when we see something totally crazy, we want that to be true. That there is an inherent bias in the analysis. So do you think there is some evolutionary benefit to it?
Well, the first thought that comes to mind is analogous perhaps to moving images. We've all been in airports and you can just watch people looking at televisions, even though they can't hear the sound or don't care, because it's moving. And why is that? Because anything that moves is either a threat or an opportunity in our evolutionary history. And so our ability to detect motion is extraordinarily important for all life forms. And so by the same token, when things that are outside the norm occur, then it challenges us in a very fundamental way. Is that something we can eat and benefit from? Or is that something that's going to hurt and kill? And you really want to know. Now, given that, which is an emotional response, proving or disproving it with scientific argument, you think would be compelling, but I don't think so for a lot of people. Then it immediately evokes prejudice and preconception and yes. So I think there's an element of that, perhaps.
So
I'm not sure. It's a good question. I'm not sure there is an evolutionary advantage. That's just a thought.
So I wonder if it's a downside risk management question, which is, suppose I am the African savannah 100,000 years ago, and I see something, and I say, I don't understand it. I could speculate on it. And I do need to speculate on it because it's sort of a high risk thing. So whatever speculation I come up with, I want that to be true because it's sort of a survival question, right? So I see something, I don't know, brown and black and checkered, and I say, no, that's not a lion, it's a python, and I'm not at risk. I want that to be true. So this idea that I want something to be true is important for survival reasons, I think. I'm just trying to, I'm just speculating here. I'm trying to get to why this is the case.
You know what went through my mind, Gill, and I think this is an oft-cited example, but one I often keep coming back to are thunderstorms. So, you know, a couple of 100,000 years ago, thunderstorms, they were frightening. They produce lightning, which can kill you and start fires, and completely non-explicable for a pre-technological society. And so that then sort of invokes gods, pacifying them, sacrifices, doing all kinds of things, earthquakes, volcanoes, same kind of thing, right? And so there is that, but with all of the three I just mentioned, pretty much, they've all been explicated scientifically. And they're no longer, I mean, they're worrisome, particularly volcanoes and earthquakes, you can't predict them, but certainly thunderstorms, you can predict them to a large extent, and you understand what causes them. It's not some magical force. And so they become less. So there's an example, perhaps, where science, let's just call it that, has removed this, you know, this emotional willingness to believe something, that there's a God there, that is Zeus throwing down lightning bolts. Why did that happen with that, but not with extraterrestrials in this case? Now, because I think the arguments we were just going through are pretty watertight and pretty convincing, but obviously not to a lot of people, right?
So this is very interesting. Yeah, so is religion a downside risk management construct, which is, after I die, what's going to happen to me? It's a downside risk question.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever religious scriptures say, I want to believe it because this is the only way I can reduce my downside risk problem. Right?
Yes, right. But there's a cost in the belief of that. So it comes as some solace, right, and structure and all of those things. But there's a cost, in terms of whether it's tithing to a church, attending services, altering one's behavior to conform to whatever the strictures of the religion are. So there is a cost-benefit analysis for people there. The thing about religion, which is interesting, and we shouldn't go off on too much of a tangent here, but there's one thing to make it contractual, in the sense like, oh, well, what's going to happen to me when I die? Well, if I believe in God, then I'll live forever, as opposed to really believing that there is a God and that he or she is a vengeful God, and if I don't believe in him or her, I'm going to go to hell or something. So I think there is a cost but it does, I think, for a lot of people, offset the tremendous fear of death. And
it's interesting. Most great scientists were never atheists. They would consider themselves to be agnostic.
Yes.
Basically saying one cannot reject the null hypothesis, there is God.
Right.
Because we don't have enough data.
No.
So even from a scientific perspective, one cannot reject God.
No, it's true.
But then, what do people use God for? I think it's more of a downside risk management question, which is, when I die, I want to go to heaven, rather than hell type issue.
But it's sort of a crazy, I don't think it's a downside risk management, because you actually have to believe it. I mean, you actually you can't just decide, oh, this will be a solution to my worry, ergo I'm going to believe in it, right? It has to be inculcated. I mean, religion and its origins are very interesting, because they're founded in, as we've talked about, emotion and uncertainty and lack of knowledge about things. But once it starts, then of course culturally it gets passed on to children, who then don't have that ability. Obviously, when they become of age, they can be objective. But if you've been taught since the year zero, there is a particular God, a particular flavor, whatever your family happens to believe in, it's very hard to break out of that. So it ceases to be objective then.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're helping general public here, but there is another interesting question, which is very meaty. So again, it just came up. Reality as we know it could be an illusion. Our universe might be holographic, and this has been around for a while.
Yes, it has. Yes.
When I don't know if it's Hawking or somebody else. Oh no, it was somebody from Stanford. I'm just forgetting his name. Basically said if information can be represented in a two-dimensional space, all the information in a black hole could be represented on its surface, then we might easily be in a holographic universe, because we are actually on the surface of something that's three-dimensional. These are things that could be tested. So this goes to astrophysics and cosmology, where people say all sorts of things.
Yes.
And from a general public's perspective, how should they internalize this? I mean, this is not a testable hypothesis.
No, clearly. Yeah. I don't know the answer to that question. I think the number of people that would actually be interested in trying to disaggregate that question is vanishingly small. And
So
those
it's not a problem.
What?
It's not a problem for,
no,
generally
for
speaking.
99.9% of the world's population. For the very small percentage who are not cosmologists and people coming up with quantum physicists, but who read about this and are interested, there are lots of books, right? So you just go in, you can read about multiverses and all those things. But again, we're right back to where we started. I think that most people then choose to rely on experts. And how do they choose their experts? I think by their history, their qualification. If you've got a Nobel Prize winner who's been around for 80 years or something, then he or she might be somebody you could perhaps trust and read their book. I don't know if we. So we've gone around on things. There are some topics such as aliens, Loch Ness Monster, which I think are more amenable to a more objective scientific
Question.
Question, affirmation or refutation. The editorial comments are a different thing. The other, and that comes right the way back to one's own prejudices. So, for example, in the recent Republican candidate debate, there was an analysis I just saw this morning where statements made by the various candidates were then fact-checked. Okay, all right, so I have to be full disclosure here. It was in the New York Times, so a lot of people will say, okay, well, they're prejudiced, right? But I don't know. They seem to be pretty objective to me. So they went through all these things. Some were right, but the vast majority were completely made up and fabricated, right? So then the question comes, okay, they can cite chapter and verse, this person did not say this on this day, even though the candidate said they did. But I don't think it carries any weight with people. I think they might say, well, maybe he didn't, but he felt that, or, I know he meant that, or whatever, So again, it's emotion.
Yeah, so
it will cloud the ability to be objective.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting arena. In the regime of ChatGPT, assuming ChatGPT has knowledge, it's very easy to have a technology that basically plugs into your ear, and when somebody says something, it's going to tell you it's 86% probability to be right, based on the information it has, right? I mean, we can actually meet this technology today.
Yeah.
And if you do, do you think people will use it?
I think they will. I think ChatGPT and other AI systems that are now widely available and are being used everywhere all the time by all kinds of people. So it's clearly providing an important tool, an important creativity tool. We're right back to the question, though, as we both know and has been explicated many times, ChatGPT, to cite one, will happily cough up fake references and all kinds of spurious data. But again, I think you keep testing it. You ask the question in a different way, and I think people will do that. I really do. There are some people who are perhaps at such one end of a spectrum, they just want to hear what they believe. But for people who are genuinely interested and are using it for a variety of things, medical questions, technical questions around your home, you probably won't believe the first answer, right? So you'll go in and use another one. But I think what I suspect is that these tools will begin to aggregate around something that is pretty close to the truth. I don't think that it's going to come up with something that is completely spurious and wrong. So I think they're very valuable in that. And the fact, just one last thing before, the fact that the language that the AI algorithm programs use is the language that we use every day, as opposed to the Google typing something in, makes it very attractive and compelling, which could make you want to believe it a bit more. But I don't have so much fear about AI. I really don't.
No, I don't either. But you seem to imply that ChatGPT knows what it's talking about.
Well, knows. What does knowledge mean? What I think, or what I believe, is that ChatGPT will crawl through the internet, looking for the keywords that you put in your question, and then using, as we all know, the various algorithms to what word follows another. I mean, it's not knowledge or insight. It's not making a judgment. Perhaps the only judgment it is making is the frequency. And another interesting question, which I'm sure could be answered, but I don't know, is do these programs favor some sources over other? So, for example, favor some sources over other. So, for example, Wikipedia is often the thing that comes up on a Google search, right? And that, because it's crowdsourced and is tested, I think tends to be pretty accurate, largely. Is there the same sort of quality of sources in these programs? Clearly, programs could be written that would just look at a particular right-wing, liberal, Christian, agnostic sites to give answers, which would foment the flames, I suppose. But assuming that's not the case, again, you'll come back to your, is it the New York Times? Is it the Economist? Or is it something National Enquirer, you know?
Yeah, I mean, so the fundamental question is historical information and known information is good enough to answer a question that's posed in the present? And in many cases, it might be. I don't know. But I can think of cases where it may not be, right? So suppose I ask, are extraterrestrials real? Historical information not going to be sufficiently robust.
Have you done that?
No, I haven't done that.
Because it's funny, just before you said that, I'm thinking that would be, because what you'd like it to have done would be to go to reputable sources and come up with the kind of argument we just went through. You know, here's the probability against it, you know, as opposed to some National Enquirer reports in the 1950s about Martians. So that would be an interesting thing to check.
But that assumes, Ian, that ChatGPT, that assumes that historical information is useful.
Yes.
To answer certain all questions in some ways, right? I would argue historical information is potentially not that useful.
I would disagree, and I've used ChatGPT quite a lot. And here's something that I've found.
Yeah.
So in looking, it happens to be on an essay on philosophy and quantum physics and what have you. It came up with what can I say? Summaries, aggregations of views, and then it will say. I can't think of the exact quote, but it was something along the lines of, based on this, it seems likely that my hypothesis X is true or is not true. So, and that's really all one can. So if you ask me a question, I'm just going to aggregate my historical data, come up with an answer or a suggestion as how one might answer it. And I think the suggestion, or it could say, there aren't enough robust data to answer your. I think that's eminently reasonable. Again, you could program that in, you know, if there are less than X sources from reputable places that can provide an answer, then tell the questioner, I don't know.
Yeah, so I wrote a blog recently, Ian. It's called The AI Loop and the Failure Mode, in which I argue that AI is based on historical data.
Yes.
And we could imagine a regime where all future data is generated by AI. So in essence, we take historical data, regurgitate it, and create future data. And if we get there, where there is no human involved, right? It's AI generating new data. Then we are in a loop that could fail it, right? So I think we are far away from getting a Chat GPT, Newton, Einstein, Maxwell version because we have no evidence that artificial intelligence is able to push into the unknown in a systematic way.
I don't know as I agree with that, because I think that, well, you said something which I don't think is true, and that is the AI loop without any input from a human. Yeah, that could happen. But there are new data coming in all the time. Okay, but that's more historical data. But humans are. So when a human interacts with an AI, it gets an answer out. The human gets an answer out, right? Which, as we've been discussing, may be right, wrong, or who knows what. But that insight can be used by the human to do something. Maybe it's to ask a more appropriate question, which, so as we both know, the ability of machines to, you do this all the time, to look at phenomenal numbers of data, to see patterns and things that have not been seen before. I mean, it's historical data, right? But here's a correlation which humans couldn't see because it's so many parameters to look at. But a machine can see that. And therefore, that's something new and is insightful, right? Isn't that true?
Yeah. No, mine was a thought experiment. So in a regime where AI agents generate all new data, let's say, I mean, it's a thought experiment.
They're running experiments, you mean, and things like that?
Sorry?
They're running experiments, you mean?
Yeah, so we have a world where humans are not involved. They're not gone away, but they are sitting in a corner. And AI is, doing everything. So in such a world, AI generates future data. But even the generative AI and all the things that are going on today, which is random experimentation on historical data, we could create new ideas, but it is random new ideas. In other words, we're not going to have a Chat GPT Einstein version anytime, I would argue, anytime for a while, which means that we might sort of settle down into a process that uses existing information and create information that sort of feeds back into it. Right?
Well, I think the thing that's missing there, of course, this gets back to the fundamental fear that a lot of people have about AI, is what is the AI trying to do? So if humans are off in a corner, not interacting with it, putting in questions or modifying the sources that it uses, I mean, what's AI going to do? I mean, but if it has, say, for example, it has been programmed to try and optimize human health and reduce healthcare costs. Okay, so it could go out and start searching, what are the most costly diseases, what's their problem, blah, 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 and then come up with thoughts, if you like. Arthritis is a major cause of late age medical expenses. We need something other than opioids and joint replacement. I am talking like it's a person. Here's something to think about. I don't quite get this loop that you're worried about, that there wouldn't be.
So that's a good example. Diseases are going to change.
Yes.
Right? So
yes.
Suppose we pick up a mutation and COVID-19, I don't want to scare people, but COVID-19 virus is cancerous.
Yes.
Looking at historical data is not going to help you in any way to solve this problem.
I've got to challenge you on that, Gil, because
Okay.
when you say, okay, so COVID-19 is cancerous, well, what's the nature of the cancer? Why does it cause cancer? What's the historical data for treating that kind of cancer? What kind of things can you use to treat cancer? Blah, 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 blah. There will be a million things that come up. And a lot of those things that humans haven't thought about. Eating grapefruit and taking cisplatin on Fridays will come together and cure COVID cancer, you know.
That might be a wrong example, but I agree with you that practical things the AI could do, but theoretical advancements, I would argue, we have had no theoretical advancement from extensions of
Right.
known information.
Okay, well, now you're on one of your, that's a different issue, and I don't disagree with you, but humans will not sit in a corner. But I would argue that the next Einstein or iconoclastic paradigm breaker will be facilitated by AI. I'm sure of that. I'm really sure of that, just by virtue of, I mean, as the amount of information is going up exponentially, the ability of a human to retain that disappears. I mean, just does. So you have to rely on machines, database analysis, in order to get to the critical issues, which then enable you to come up with a theory, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I think machines are going to hold humans back in the future because the way they are constructed, which is basically propagating history. The reason humans are here, I would argue, is that 0.0001% of the human knew how to kill the lion or how to throw the arrow in a more optimum way, or how to figure out how the universe works. That's why we are here. But machines are not going to do that. I don't think. I think they're going to go back and look at history. Yeah.
Well, okay, you have said several times, and I know you're just being kind, but I'll say something and you say, "Oh, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that." And all I was doing is just recounting my history.
Oh yeah.
I mean, so as far as you know, in fact, this could be the Turing test. It's not me speaking; it's my program. I've got a hologram, which is just going through historical data that happens to be stuck in my brain. I don't think you're right here, Gil. I don't agree with you. I know you have this strong belief that it's just churning over, and no, I don't believe it.
So let me ask you this. I believe we are reliant on a very, very small percentage of the population to advance knowledge.
Yeah.
Humans are basically automatons. I mean, we have our experiences, we have our logic, our biases. And once in a while, every 100, 200 years, somebody comes along and changes the world.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see a new ChatGPT coming along and changing the world. I think that is where
Well, here's another interesting question that we should ask ChatGPT about, what's the probability and likelihood of aliens. You should also ask it, and I will do this once we get off this, is to say, if Einstein had access to you, ChatGPT-4 or whatever, do you think he would have come up with his ideas earlier? Or you don't know that until you see the answer. But there's your prejudice. It's right where we started, Gil. You have this strong prejudice, which I think is, you're raising good questions. Should we be afraid of this? Blah, 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 blah. But I think the two flaws in your argument, at least that I hear, one is that humans will absent themselves from this interaction, which they won't. And the second one is that there will be no stimuli or insights by looking at historical data that come out of AI that somebody won't then be able to take and make an iconoclastic advance, which they wouldn't have been able to do absent the ability to look at all that historical data.
No, I'm saying we can get a lot of insights. I do that for a living, right? So we can get a lot of insights from data. Yeah. But what I'm arguing is that we won't get an Einstein ChatGPT in the future. Because as you say, if
they're just consistently
Sorry?
Comes up with new theories of relativity or universes. Oh,
Yeah,
well,
so
I don't know.
so unfortunately, we started off trying to figure out how to get away from fake news,
Yes.
but we ended up with speculations.
Well,
in, in fact, we are creating fake news. Yeah.
perhaps if there were to be some common ground on how to get away from fake news, I think from my part, I would say challenge your prejudices, ascertain quality of your source as robustly as you can on objective data, and question the influence of that source, advertising, prejudice, what have you. And as we both know, and we were going to go down there, but we haven't, is science. I mean, science is corrupt.
So, yeah.
But also because scientists, a lot of them, unfortunately, hunt for evidence to affirm their hypothesis. Seldom do they look for evidence to disprove it, largely.
Yeah. So I think if we can leave one thought behind, I think if you agree, is that when a new piece comes along, you could take that to some sort of a process, some sort of
Yes.
scientific process that
Yes.
says, here's a null hypothesis.
Yes.
Let me go look at the data.
Yes.
Use ChatGPT, use Google, whatever you want to do.
Yes.
But get a lot of data, right? I mean, it's not like one piece of data. I mean, you get a lot of data.
Yes.
And then see if we can reject that null hypothesis or not, right? I mean, that's the process we need to go through before we accept something. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say it won't happen simply because nobody has the time to do that. And also for a lot of the news that people consume, it's not that important to put that amount of time and effort and money and utility into it, right? However, and this I think has been discussed elsewhere, one could imagine an AI software program that would do the analysis for you.
That'd be a little
it's a little circular.
Yeah.
But you could say, I'm just making this up now, such and such was reported today in the New York Times. Based on your access to databases, is this likely to be true? I'm being very simplistic here, but because essentially that's what you're saying is, except perhaps you're not advocating using AI to do it. But if you don't use AI, how is an ordinary person, anybody, going to get all those data? It's impossible, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the answer to this, Ian, but I'm concerned about using history as the only way to determine truth.
What else could you use?
What
else can you use?
I don't know. I don't have that. Okay. I don't have the answer. But imagine if AI were, really advanced, say, 15 years ago, and all this stuff that these politicians have been talking about last 15 years, most of it is garbage. So all of this information in the social media is a raw materials for AI to learn. And we had two instances from, a large software company in Redmond. One is called Twitter Girl, and the other is the latest iteration of AI. The first one became racist, like in 10 seconds.
Yeah.
And the second one wanted to kill everybody in 15 seconds. So,
well, those are oft-cited ones, but I'm not sure. I mean, if you use ChatGPT and other things, they go to great lengths not to get involved in, those kinds of things. But I coming back to my question a minute ago, I mean, you ask a good one. If your hypothesis that restricting yourself to historical data will limit and confine and make advances difficult, I don't know what did Einstein use if not historical data, if his own thoughts and
his own thoughts, I think.
Yeah,
It's
well,
not
but
thought.
thoughts, what are thoughts? Thoughts are accessing experiences that you've had and putting them in a slightly different way, perhaps. But
I'm
again,
not
if you
sure.
are,
Yeah.
what, yeah,
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, so you and I are both music fans, So
I'm
would
going to come back to
you know
Pink Floyd eventually.
would
That's
Pink
the
Floyd
answer.
have created something by just looking at what everybody else has created in history? I don't think so. I think these are thoughts that are not there.
Okay.
You create these thoughts,
So
and
what is
only
the
few people. Yeah.
what is the stimulus to create these thoughts?
That I don't know. So because we don't have too many people doing it, so it would be interesting, because 8 billion people on the planet. I would think maybe a dozen people might be doing it. So
I disagree there. I disagree there, Gill, because yeah, I mean there are 8 billion people on the planet, and up until fairly recently, by which I mean this century, most of them were living on $1 a day and wondering what the next meal's coming from. So the ones that actually have the time and the, let's call it the education training, whatever you want to call it, to think about creativity, I think there's an enormous amount of creativity, an enormous amount.
Yeah.
Really?
It's not a judgment on creativity or competence. It's just an observation of practicality, right? Most people, as you say, is running for the next dollar.
Yeah.
That's where we are. And of those ones who don't have that problem, have the luxury to thinking about it, I mean, they're substantial number. So I would argue, I don't have any data on this. So 8 billion people, maybe 500 million of them are not constrained by significant resource constraint. Of the 500 million, you still find maybe a dozen people who could change the world. So it is pretty small,
But I think that just says that the particular neuronal architecture that arises through mutation or random events, and not just genetics, is very rare. And I don't think that's going to go necessarily up or down. I do have this belief, and it's perhaps I should check my own prejudices. I don't know why I believe this, but I do believe that we will see more innovative and creative and perhaps iconoclastic change by virtue of having access to things like, perhaps starting with the internet, AI, whatever comes later. I just think that will be true. It'd be an interesting thing to see. I don't think it's going to stop that, which is perhaps the most important point, right?
Yeah, we should have a debate on this particular topic. So we are at the opposite ends of this idea. I believe human creativity is going to stop as artificial intelligence advances.
Yeah, why don't we take that as the next thing? Because
yeah.
I disagree strongly on that. And that's a very interesting point. Unless you argue that so many people are playing Super Mario 3 or whatever the latest, that they haven't got any time to come up with a new theory of relativity.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very, very interesting. So why don't we take this as a topic for the next session?
Sounds great, Gill. Good.
Excellent.
I've enjoyed
Thanks for doing
talking
this
to you.
again.
Yeah, okay. Bye-bye.
Nice to see you.